Welcome to Bunny Hugs and Mental Health, the podcast that deals with all things mental health. We talk to professionals, survivors, and loved ones about their sometimes informative, sometimes uplifting, and sometimes tragic stories. I'm your host of the show, Todd Rennebaum, advocate, recovering addict, experienced sufferer of depression and anxiety, and author of the children's book, Sometimes Daddy Cries. Hello, I'm Todd Rennebaum, and you are listening to Bunny Hugs and Mental Health on the Saskatchewan Podcast Network. That's right, I am now on the Saskatchewan Podcast Network with many other wonderful Saskatchewan-made podcasts. So I suggest you go on the website, go on their Facebook page, and or their Instagram, and check out lots of other great podcasts here in Saskatchewan. Another wonderful thing to check out is Penny University Bookstore. They are on 3104 13th Avenue in Regina. Their phone number is 639-571-2186. Visit Annabelle, or you can go on to pennyu.ca, and you can shop for books online there. Annabelle's not online, but she's in the store. So either way, get some books. Okay. Before I introduce our guest my guest, I guess, our guest for this episode, I'd just like to give a big thank you to Julian Hammond-Fafard, Heather Ashton, and Natalie Camilla for all their wonderful shares and comments and things to me over the last week. I really appreciate it. Sometimes it is really discouraging doing a podcast, and maybe you're not getting as many listens as you want, or you're not sure if it's worth doing it, and then you hear some really wonderful things from wonderful people, and it's like, oh, okay, it's nice doing this. Anyway, I have a bit of a doozy of a show here. Today we are discussing intergenerational trauma in the Indigenous community, and what that looks like for one specific lady in her family. Her name is Erin Goodpipe. She is the host of The Other Side, which is on APTN. She's a playwright, producer, and performer of the play Making Treaty 4. I've seen it many times. I love it. It's amazing. I worked at Globe Theatre when it was performed there. I worked there for 2.5 years. It was my favorite play I ever saw. So anyway, and so she's going to talk a little bit about not just intergenerational trauma, but how that looks in her family, and what it takes to heal, and all types of wonderful things. This episode, usually at my episodes, I try not to go over an hour. Erin and I talked for nearly an hour and a half, so I've decided to make this a 2-part series. So this week is part 1. Then I will do a different episode next week, and then the week after that I'll do part 2. So you get a bit of a break, you get to hear some other stuff, and then you can listen to part 2 again in 2 weeks' time. So without further ado, Erin Goodpipe.
These are huge topics, and I know sometimes people, they want it nicely packaged in, like a few sentences or a paragraph or a few minutes. And, that's just not the nature of these types of questions. And I think that's even a big part of destigmatizing mental health and how we take care of one another, is providing the space and the resources to listen to people and have them actually be listened to hear the full story, right? So that's part of what I want to talk about today, actually. And I think your podcast is illustrating that point really bang on, that we just need to listen to people. But to get into it, I think, intergenerational trauma is so intertwined with my life. I consider myself, I would introduce myself. I would say, Hamatakapi, Erin Chinupa Washte Makyapi, Damakotawia Anishinaabe Kwe, Tatankanashi Itaha Wahi. So my name is Erin Goodpipe. I am Anishinaabe and Dakota. I also have some Cree in me. And I have band membership on Standing Buffalo Dakota Nation in Treaty 4 territory. I find that it's really important for me as an Indigenous person to first introduce myself that way. It's not just for the other person, but it's also for, in a spiritual way, to acknowledge who I am to, the things that are around me. That's really important for myself as a person and my spiritual worldviews. And when I say that, that's that identity piece, that language piece, and that grounding is so central to my own healing, my presence here as an Indigenous person, and just that holistic health side of addressing myself in all the realms. So I just wanted to say that and start off in that way. And kind of from there, I'll go backwards. And, I'm just going to start from the beginning.
There you go. Okay.
Yes, I think that's a really great place to start. We're talking about like intergenerational trauma. And what does that really mean? And to me, that's really, taking the things that have happened throughout my generations, through my kinship, through my family line. And those are the memories that are attached, going back into the generations. We have this sort of saying, it's also scientifically proven as well, but we call it blood memory. And essentially what blood memory is talking about how our genes and our blood, like our biology, it actually carries memories. And, when we begin to think about the things that have happened to Indigenous people and all peoples, but obviously I'm going to focus on the Indigenous aspect of everything, is that we do carry that memory within our entire being. And so, we're not just static to this moment in time. We actually carry the stories of those who have come before us. I begin to think about that, when I feel as though, intergenerational trauma, it is really an activating of all of those memories that I carry from my family line. And that goes sort of both ways, because we talk about intergenerational trauma, but we also need to acknowledge intergenerational resilience and intergenerational strength. And so when I begin to talk about these concepts, I really want people to know that, there are those differing sides of this, right? It's not just like all negative. There are positives too. I mean, the fact that I'm still here as an Indigenous person is such a testament to that resilience and that strength. And for all Indigenous people who are here and, surviving and thriving at the same time. So that's so important, right? For me, I was born in Vancouver. I was born to two Indigenous young people who had actually come from the prairies. And if I follow my stories, my parents' stories, their parents themselves had been going through really intense things, coming out of residential school, really suffering the effects of dysfunctional family lives or community life, having a disconnect to family, a disconnect to community and culture, and rightfully so. They're coming out of residential school. They've been fragmented from their community, essentially. They've been forced to go. They've been segregated and not necessarily given the education that when we think of schooling, we think about being taught, math, sciences, Englishes, language, all those sorts of things. But the reality of residential school is that they were actually taught many labor and agriculture and farm intensive things. I mean, I hear stories in my own family line where many people didn't necessarily know how to read coming out of residential school. They actually knew how to, do chores and do lots of labor work. So it wasn't the type of education that, when we think of education, we correlate it to all those sort of academic subjects. So it's not as if they were, really well equipped, right, coming out of residential school to go on and pursue post-secondary, to go on and pursue other fields. They knew how to work, that's for sure.
Right.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point when we think about residential school, is that they didn't, get that education aspect that we think of today. And then, of course, we want to talk about, the abuses that went on there. on top of being fragmented from your community and your family, not being able to practice your culture, not being able to speak your language, and actually being really condemned for it. Those things begin to become internalized, right? And so you have a whole generation of Indigenous people, and I'm talking like thousands of people coming out of these schools who feel ashamed to be Indian. That has profound impacts. I know I've experienced that as a young person in these systems, education systems, healthcare systems, social justice or social welfare systems. But I can't, it's like the tip of the iceberg compared to what my relatives went to before me, or went through before me in this regard. But yeah, coming out and literally, you know, the racism that I grew up hearing in my family line was so intense. And then on top of them feeling just so ashamed of being Indian because it was basically beaten out of them.
Right. It's almost like instead of calling them residential schools, they should be like concentration camps.
That's absolutely it. No, it really, really is. You know, I really wish we could call it something else because, yeah, the stories that, you know, I grew up hearing are just, they're horrendous, you know, like I went through a phase of my life where I was quite angry. And it's interesting when we think about mental emotional health for Indigenous people. But I've always noticed this, and I sort of said this, and there's this period of time for Indigenous people when we begin to learn about our histories in our families and also, you know, why these things happened. And what I mean by that is, like, you know, I had the opportunity to begin to learn about colonialism, right, and the history of Canada, and the history of the usurpation of our lands and all that goes with, you know, the colonial narrative or the colonial agenda that has happened to Indigenous people. And you begin to see that direct impact on your family because this didn't happen, you know, like this didn't happen hundreds and hundreds of years ago. You know, this happened to my grandparents, to my parents, and all of my aunts and uncles. I can't name any of my older relatives who did not go to residential school. So this is something that happened, you know, just kind of almost yesterday, you know. That sounds really intense to say, but it did feel like it was like this is just happening yesterday. And so anyways, I had the privilege of being able to grow up to an extent and learn about my history and why these things were happening to my family. And so I noticed that I was becoming really angry. Like I was very upset about these things, you know, the reality of what was going on or the truth of what was going on here. You know, it wasn't just, oh, my mom is an alcoholic and a drug abuser and my father, you know, it's not that, you know, they are those things. And my family, you know, has had this narrative in my family, but, you know, there's reasons for this now. And so it was like I was angry at, you know, the government, and I was angry at Canada, and I was angry at, you know, quote unquote white people, non-Indigenous people. I was like, you know, how could this happen? And it's almost silly to think like that this, you know, wouldn't be upsetting, right? And so there's this period of time that I believe happens for Indigenous people once we begin to know our family history and then know and become educated about why those things have happened. And this is period of time where it's like you're grappling with that reality and the injustice of it all. And I think for some people, you know, that can happen this period of time for, you know, months. For some people, it happens for years. And for some people, it doesn't go away, you know? And that's something that's really important when we're thinking about addressing intergenerational trauma is, you know, if you're going to begin to address those realities and those stories that are in your blood memory flowing through you, and you're going to begin to think about them and learn about them, and you're going to be engaged in, you know, the Indigenous reality in Canada or on Turtle Island, we have to think about how we're going to take care of ourselves in that time, because it's just so intense to face those things. And unfortunately, it's absolutely necessary, I believe, to heal and to transform that narrative. But I believe it's so important to recognize that space that, you know, holding injustice and holding that grief of intergenerational trauma, because, you know, as Indigenous people, and Elder said this before, but, you know, we don't find a lot of other people, you know, holding or carrying their families the same way that Indigenous people do. And what I mean by that is that we, when I go and do something, I feel as though I have to represent myself well, because I'm carrying all of, my family and my people behind me. I'm representing them. And that's a really big burden to carry.
I've talking about kind of trauma being passed along in your blood and stuff. Like, I'm in recovery from alcohol and drugs, and my wife's a holistic body talk. It's called. She does. I can. I mean, I can't relate, but I can totally relate, because I feel as though my alcoholism was a trauma that's been passed down. It's my father drank, my grandfather drank, and I have many times felt like part of my recovery is actually healing their traumas and their
absolutely.
Just like you said, you're healing your, not just yourself, but you have this pressure to heal like this whole lineage that you're part of, and that you are continuing with children and everything else. So I mean, on a much minor scale than my entire
totally. I think that's totally true. Yeah. But thank you for saying that point, because it's true. And, I preface that because an elder said that to me before. And I think a part of it is the cultural worldview that we represent our families as Indigenous people. Like, it's so inherent in our culture. And also we have there's this sort of spiritual concept where we're always thinking of the 7 generations before us and the 7 generations after us. And so everything that we do in our earth walk is about activating that sense that, we have a responsibility to those who came before us and those who are coming after us. And that responsibility is absolutely integral to our character and our whole purpose or reason for walking on the earth. So yeah, and I totally hear that, like with, the struggle or the journey that you have been on. And I think it's so interesting, because I think we have to go back and examine, why it is that we've, gone into these certain paths. And I think they come from somewhere, right? It's always that question of where does this come from?
Right.
And I think, for me, it's really interesting. I said that my families, they came from the prairies. My mother, Shelley, she's passed on now, and she passed away from a fentanyl overdose on the downtown East Hastings over here in Vancouver, which is where I am now. And, my mom, she came from, very sort of really harsh upbringing. Her parents were gone by the time she was 3. Through suicide and murder. And then she was in and out of, foster care, and then lived with various family members where there was a lot of dysfunction, a lot of violence, a lot of destruction, essentially, a lot of substance abuse, sort of that mishmatch of all of that. And, as a young person, one of her aunties had actually, decided to come out to the West Coast. And so my mother and her brothers joined her, and I can't say that it was the best living, because my auntie, who I call her, but it was my mom's auntie, she was dealing with her own things, long story short. And so my mom ended up kind of like a street kid, basically, sort of fending for herself, and began to be involved in certain situations, like, getting involved with drugs at a really, really young age, getting involved with like prostitution at a really, really young age. And crime, all sorts of other things interlaced within that narrative at the time for her. So that was sort of my mom growing up. And my dad is it's a very similar story. My father, his 2 parents from Manitoba, in that region, and also they too were sort of fleeing what was going on at home, coming out of residential school and fleeing certain violent, destructive family and community atmospheres, right? And so fleeing west, just sort of this idea of just getting away from what was going on. And so you have actually quite a number of prairie Indigenous people who ended up on the West Coast, I think for similar reasons. You'll find sort of a very interesting population over here. And many of them ended up in poverty, actually, and on the street. And, it wasn't, it was very interesting because my mom growing up, when I did live out here on the West Coast, oftentimes she would sort of take off, right? And she would go, to Hastings or to some of these places that weren't so good and, use and abuse drugs and kind of be on the street. And so I would come with her sometimes. And, she really, I always found it really interesting because I met so many Indigenous people who were actually from the prairies. And I was like, oh, that's really neat and sort of interesting. How did you end up here? It was always that question, right? And how come so many of us are here? So that's just an inquiry that I always wondered about. But I think it relates a lot to the similar story that you and I are talking about, which is that intergenerational trauma and trying to flee certain situations and then ending up in the street and not having a society that supports you and is racist and unjust towards your people, essentially. Those things are, it's all really important to know. And I didn't know that as a young person. I just saw that it was like, my parents, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, they're all sort of really engaged in this process that's really unhealthy and dysfunctional.
So instead of healing, they fled from it, which then passed the trauma on further and further.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a way, you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I think that it gets reproduced, right? I mean, it's easy. Yeah. It's very hard from what I've noticed in my own family life, my personal life, but also in the work that I do. I've worked with youth in a number of Indigenous communities and other communities. And, I find that if you have, an environment that's very unhealthy, it's going to be really hard even if you're the one who's like, I don't want any of this and you want to change and not be a part of that narrative. It's just so hard to not get embedded in it if everything around you is that. And so it's hard to, we have certain programs that will sort of try and take you out of that situation. But that's really difficult, especially when it's your family, right? Because it's your family. You always want to be near your family. You want to be near what's familiar, right? And I can even say when I was, young, I definitely wanted to be near my family, no matter how destructive they were. It was like I would still choose my family over, being segregated and isolated and alone. I would still choose the dysfunction because I love them that much. So I think that speaks to, how we reproduce, just sort of dysfunctional cycles just by way of us wanting to be near to what's familiar.
Right. When I worked at Pine Lodge for a few years before the fire and whatever else is happening there right now, but there was a young lady who came from a local reserve, and she spent the whole month, and she did really, really well. She came out of her shell, and she was doing wonderful. She found out she was pregnant while she was in treatment. She was glowing. She was lovely.
Yeah.
And the last day when she was leaving, she looked like a truck hit her, and I said, "What's going on? You look really sad."
Yeah.
And she basically said what you said. She's like, "Well, I'm going back to my family. I'm going back to my reserve. I'm going back to my husband, and I'm basically just going right back into the hornet's nest of abuse. Her husband abuses her, but that's her choice. Like you said, she still chose her family, and chose what she knows because that's who she loves, and so I don't know. I haven't heard hide nor hair of her since, but my heart just completely broke because I saw her heal, or not fully heal, but I saw her healing, and then I just saw her like go back, like basically it was like the first day she came in again, and it was like, oh my God.
Right. And it's so heartbreaking, and I think it speaks to the dilemma that we're in as human beings, actually, because it's like we can't just fragment ourselves apart from our social situations, and the crappy part about healing or wanting something that's different than where you came from is that you can't change people. They have to want that for themselves. I mean, you can support and love But one of the hardest realities for me to learn in addressing my own intergenerational trauma was that I couldn't change my mom. I couldn't change my father. I couldn't change my cousins. And I fought for a long time to be a part of that and to support and to love them. But I realized that it was like, no, they have to make that choice. They have to want that, right? And I grapple with that all the time. It's still an ongoing thing that I need to learn, and I have to have boundaries with it too, right?
Right. Yeah.
And, I actually was one of the people who I made the choice to actually leave my family by the time I was 14 and 15. I actually left, and I actually had grown up where I was in foster care when I was younger. And my mom was really struggling, as a younger person, being a mom and with her own, addictions and everything else that was going on. And actually we would try to evade social services. So we would move back and forth between the West Coast and Regina, and then other places in Saskatchewan sometimes. So I was like moving around quite often. And it became sort of this, we sort of felt like fugitives. Like I felt like a fugitive, like that we were always in secret or hiding or running away from. Those are some of my earliest memories as like a 2, 3, 4-year-old. And, I think I have like this part of my own trauma is also dealing with the trauma of seeing society as, like an enemy, because I feel like It's like they were always against us or always looking for something that was wrong, and not supporting my mom in a holistic way for her healing, because what should have happened, I think, was, you keep mother and child together. I'd never agree with breaking up families unless there's some really severe circumstances that are going on. But I think we need to begin to think of healing as, the family unit needs to be healed. The collective unit needs to be healed. Otherwise, there's always going to be this dilemma, right? Where individuals need to make the choice to break from their family. And that's really tough. That's a really tough human dilemma to be in.
Can I give you a stat?
Yes, please.
Indigenous kids represent less than 8% of kids under 14 years of age in Canada and make up 52% of the kids in childcare systems.
Exactly. Yes. I know that stat. I know that stat. And the same is true if you were to look up incarceration for Indigenous people. If you were to look up poverty stats, if you were to look up in healthcare, health determinants, you would see that Indigenous people make, a small percentage of the population, yet we are overrepresented in the negative stats in almost every sector of society. So you begin to put those dots together and you're like, hold on, this isn't right. What's going on here? Because this doesn't look right. And so that is a part of that, the educational part where we're like, okay, hold on. There's more that's going on here. And as Indigenous people, I think we have a little bit of leverage because we have some of those family stories, right? And if you're lucky, you come from a family who is they know about these things, right? And I can't say that's true for every Indigenous family, but I was lucky at one point. So I moved away from home by the time I was 14, 15. I actually made the choice to run away. And that was really difficult because I just so badly wanted my mom to get better, and there was a very violent situation that she was in with her partner. And I was like the second mom to my siblings. And, that was a really tough decision for me because I knew if I left, they might be more vulnerable because I was oftentimes providing or protecting them, right?
You still are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. It's a big part of my life. But so when I was 14 and 15, I just, it was probably one of the hardest decisions I ever made, Todd, which was to leave, to run away and leave and say, I'm going to try and forge my own path, no matter how hard that is. But I knew that I couldn't live in that situation anymore, with my mom, with her partner, and with the situation that was going on there with my mother's addictions and her trauma. I'm a very absorbing person. And as a young person, I began to see, this is going to make me feel depressed. I'm taking this on, and I feel like it's almost like you can't save a drowning person, and then also try and swim yourself, right? It's like we're both probably going to drown.
Right.
And that's what it felt like. So I actually, I returned home, and by home, I mean my reserve, because I knew that there was a sense of community there, and I knew that there was a sense of identity there, and there is a sense of, a sense of my culture there. And I had been exposed to culture, and that was, ceremony and tradition, and that's where I felt seen as an Indigenous person, and I knew that would sort of be my way out. So that's been a big part of my, I guess, my own healing. The reclamation of who I am as an Indigenous person has everything to do with my healing and getting out of those situations. And so I went back to my reserve, and I was very fortunate to be adopted into traditional circles there, and have the privilege of, being exposed to land-based stuff and culture and ceremony, and began to build up this identity of purpose and being connected to greater things. And it totally overshadowed the so-called circumstances of where I came from, and I began to have this lens of, seeing my parents as, human beings, and having that sympathy for them, and I still wrestle with that sometimes. I'm in a very good place now where I understand where they were as human beings and where they are as human beings. But I still, obviously I think you wrestle with, well, you're still supposed to be my mother and my father, right? Like, that's always sort of there, but you learn to work with that. And I relate healing to grief a lot. And grief to me is not something that you can just do and then it's gone. It's it's ongoing. It's something that you learn to work with and to live with, right? And I think that's important in healing trauma.
Yeah. Everything you're saying sounds very familiar. I've heard it from many past clients in Pine Lodge. I mean, we've had like gang members who grew up fully, in a core area of the city, shooting at police, and they healed by, getting sober, but they healed by, embracing their traditions and their culture, and talking to elders and all that, and being part of ceremony, and I've heard that so many times. I mean, that is the healing, right? I mean, that was the wound, was taking that culture away. Yes. And I think, the way to heal is to take it back.
Absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating because I've worked in research where we're addressing health and well-being of Indigenous youth, and culture, for whatever reason, is so powerful in combating all of the adversity that these youth are facing, or that Indigenous people are facing, and for whatever reason, culture's got that powerfulness to it. And my own mom, actually, she asked me before she passed away, she said, me and your dad are fuck ups, so how did you make it out? Even my own mom was like, how are you doing this? And my mother asked me the first time when I was like a teenager, I wasn't super old at this point, and I didn't have an answer for her. I said, I don't know. I thought it was like, I don't know. I was like, for whatever reason, this is just what it is, and as a young person, I just so greatly wanted more. I knew when I was young that I did not want to be caught up in drugs and alcohol, because I had seen so much of the destruction, the chaos, and the turmoil, the hurt, and the list goes on. And I didn't want that for my children and for my line. And I knew that it had to stop with me. And I would do whatever it was going to take to do that. And even, there's some huge sacrifices that were made, and implications of that sometimes I still regret. Like, I have a sister, and she's really struggling in her own addictions. And sometimes I wonder if I didn't leave or run away, if she might have had a different path, if I was there for her. And so those are things, that there are impacts there, right? But I just knew, like I said, when I was young, that I just wanted something more than that. I just knew it so deeply in my heart. But, so when my mom asked that, that's what I could just boil it down to. And now as I've, grown and matured and learned, I've learned a lot. I have answers to that question, and a big part of that is having a sense of identity, having a sense of who I am as a person, and knowing that, I don't have to carry the shame of my mother and my father as Indigenous people, that I can be proud of who I am, that I come from a culture that's connected to the land, and that we activate this spiritual understanding of everything. We're a part of something that's really big and really important and really special. And that spiritual worldview informs every aspect of my walk here, of every aspect of my health and well-being. And that's, that collectiveness, being a part of, being an individual that's connected to something greater than you, that's a huge part of our identity. And that's what saw me through, so much. And also that identity comes from community, like having healthy community who's going to love and support you. And we have this thing in our culture. It's an adoption is what I could narrow it down to. And what happens is through ceremony, we adopt one another. I have aunts and uncles now. I have brothers and sisters. I have cousins. I have grandmothers and grandfathers who aren't, we're not related by blood, but we're related by our stories. We're related by our kinship ties. Those are the things that connect us, and I don't see them as any different. And so even though I was without, my parents at times, I was without a healthy family in the blood sense, I actually gained so much family in another sense. And so it is really that sense of culture and community that paved the way for me to be, where I'm at today anyways. A better sense of healing, a better sense of transforming that line. But I owe so much to that. So if my mom was alive today, I would tell her that. Yeah.
How long ago did she pass?
My mother passed away in December of 2016. Yeah, so it's been about 5 years.
How good is it, that feeling that you no longer have resentment towards your parents, but instead empathy?
What is that like? Is that your question? Yeah, it's...
like, how good does that feel? Like, going through treatment and healing myself, it's like things like that I used to have resentment for, and now that I have empathy for, it's like such a lighter feeling and such
It's it absolutely is. It's freeing. The word freeing comes out. And I still grapple with it. I there's times where it's like you can see the hole, right? Where like that you could fall in, but you have this sight now to see it. And, I have my younger siblings who aren't necessarily in that place, like they're still really upset with their parents. And, I still have that in me too. And it would be stupid of me to think that that's not there, because of course I want my parents to have been, parents. I feel like it's sort of like my right almost, as a human being, because it's like, I didn't ask to be here, but I am here and I am grateful for my life. And, I just so much wish in my heart that, of course, I wanted healthy parents, and of course I wanted family. That's one of my biggest wishes still, and I can't pretend like that wish isn't there. But I see my family, my parents as human beings, I see them with a sense of compassion, and I see and have analyzed and reflected on, what they have gone through. And as I myself go through life, I begin to have more insight about, the hardship of life itself, on top of, the adversities that my parents went through. So, that's been a really humbling experience for me to feel that sense of like freedom and understanding in that freedom. Yeah.
Oh, God damn it. I hate when I do this. I don't want to write every episode. I do this. I had a point and I didn't write it down. And
I do that too. I honestly need to have like a pen or a pencil. Like I just like, sometimes you got to write down a word, right? And you're like, oh, like,
exactly.
Reel me in here.
Thank you so much, Erin. It's wonderful talking to someone about this stuff, and it's just nice talking to you. You're just a great lady and nice to talk to. So thank you so much for that. Part 2, like I said, will be not next week, but the week after. And I have to apologize. When I was editing, I felt like I was making some really... I sounded like an idiot in this episode for some reason. Maybe I don't, but maybe I'm just paranoid or self-conscious. But some of the points I made and stuff was like, what am I talking about? Like, why am I'm rambling and I'm not making much sense. Anyway, so if you think I sounded like an idiot, I agree. Next week, I'm talking to Sandy McDonald, and she's the co-founder and executive director of IAPMD. That is the International Association for Premenstrual Disorders. So you're thinking, what's a premenstrual disorder got to do with mental health? Well, you'll find out. It actually is a mental health disorder, and it involves women only. And there's a lot of misdiagnosed women that have been diagnosed with bipolar who actually have PMDD, and it involves their cycles. And you're going to learn a lot next week. I learned a lot. I know women who had no idea about this thing, and they say it's 1 in 20 women that have this, and possibly up to 1 in 10 women. So stay tuned and listen to that episode, because I think you're going to learn a lot. And then the week after that again is a part 2 of Erin Goodpipe and mine conversation. So there you go. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe, rate, and review however you are listening to this podcast. It only takes a moment, and it really helps the show out with getting noticed. This episode has been sponsored by Penny University Bookstore, 3104 13th Avenue. Call 639-571-2186 and check out their online bookstore at pennyu.ca. The Saskatchewan Podcast Network is supported by Connexus. Wellness, however you define it, is achievable. You don't even need to figure it all out by yourself. Talk to Connexus. They'll give you guidance, motivation, and the push you need to reach your goals. They've got you. They're your financial partner, and they know you can achieve your very best, your financial best. Prove them right. Start right at Connexus Credit Union. The Saskatchewan Podcast Network is also sponsored by Direct West. Are you a business owner looking for new avenues to promote your business? Direct West digital billboards are a great opportunity to highlight a new product, new promotion, or anything else you'd like your customers to know about. You can get local, expert marketing help for your business at directwest.com. If you are having a mental health crisis, please call the Canadian Crisis number at 1-833-456-4566. In Saskatchewan, the mobile crisis team in Prince Albert is 306-764-1011. In Regina, it's 306-525-5333, and in Saskatoon, it's 306-933-6200. Don't forget to check out my children's book, Sometimes Daddy Cries. Sometimes Daddy Cries is told through the eyes of a boy whose father suffers from depression. He sees his dad get sad, rest, and even go to the hospital, all while comparing his father's depression to a physical ailment. Available on Amazon.ca. I'll see you next time. This is Todd Redebaum saying, make your beds and take your meds. Bye.